Afternoon, class. Or good evening. The past few lessons that we have discussed or that you have um, learned. I think that was like almost 3 weeks ago. These were all uh, asynchronous mode, and also this one is still asynchronous. But I'm going to meet you after this for a synchronous class discussion before we are going to start our reporting. By the way, you have to get access to this, and then by Wednesday next week, today is Sunday, by next week, by this coming Wednesday, we will have a synchronous class, but anybody of you must prepare a report, no? A report that will be discussed in class because that will be part of our lesson, no? This coming Wednesday. And then because I plan that one will report and on Wednesday, and the other, say for example, uh, the other say two reporters will report on Friday in the evening of Friday. That is August 30, right? August 30. So that means on August 30, that is Friday. So we'll have the reporting. Uh, the last meeting for that, and then please prepare also because I'm going to do the wrap up and things like that will conclude the rest of the semester. The Saturday after that, no, we will have a class on Friday. The Saturday we will have an exam. No, I'm going to give you the final exam. Actually, it's a module exam. Okay, it's a module exam for module 4 and 5 because we already have exam for module 2 and 3. Okay, that is for exam for module 4 and 5, and then take note just to give you a chance for really getting a good grade in this class. Your report, actually, your report actually will be equivalent to a module exam. So make good on your report and uh, make it completed. Write something that is complete, and of course, do the best in your report because that report is equivalent to your module exam. That is module 6. No? So I'm not going to give you exam for that, but your report will count that is equivalent for that particular rating segment. Okay? So take note of that reminder so that this time we will continue with our lecture on global trends and models of in agribusiness development that is affecting the industry as a whole. No? As a whole. Now we know already that the first say lesson 5.1 and 5.2, we were discussing about the context of global trends and models, and then of course we have discussed very importantly in that lesson on the influence of population growth and also the influence of climate change and then the influence of uh, population growth, climate change, and also the influence of like dwindling resources, and of course, very importantly, the influence of the fourth IR or the fourth industrial revolution. Okay, so uh, in the fourth industrial revolution, it's all about connectivity. Okay, so in other words, there are transactions that are done virtually, and of course, more than that, there is a disruptive effect to many of our traditional, say, for example, processes and practices, and it will, of course, increase productivity for all particular, like, for example, products and processes in agribusiness for agribusiness commodity. Okay. Now this time is a continuation of global trends and models affecting the agribusiness at an industry setting. Now, the previous to this lecture, the previous topic we discussed on clustering of supply chains. And that is exactly what is happening now, and even at the industry level, there is clustering because clustering, clustering because of the fact that the the market, the market uh, development, and even the market itself is already global. Okay, now we need to cluster in order to compete in the market far more better than the rest of your other competitor. In other words, the competition in the global market is no longer in terms of individual firms, but it's going to be competition between supply chains or value chains. Okay, so you compete according to your the way you cluster, the way you position your the entire global value chain, competing that with another global value chain in order to serve market from various places. Okay, so the second and the last, say, global trends and models that will impact on agribusiness at the industry level is what we call as the food supply distribution system. Well, clustering is one platform, and then furthermore, we see this particular, say, trends and models that will change the way we look at agribusiness. Okay, now food supply distribution system. Now we will this particular presentation is based upon decisively based on the paper by Armendaris and others, no, and et al. In 2015. But the way they present this paper, they are really looking at what is going to happen to the uh, the, uh, the present convention in terms of really responding to the market and also responding to the needs of the customer and responding to the transformation in the entire spectrum of the food supply and the distribution system. Okay, so in this particular model, or in this particular, say, global trend, we are looking at an integrated, say, for example, market that does not only look at how the food is distributed, but we also look at the connection and the interaction between the food supply or food production and the distribution system, as it is affected by various factors. Why is that so? Why is that so? The main inspiration of this particular model, the main inspiration is that as population increases, okay, as population increases, we know already that, for example, by year 2040 or 2050, population becomes almost like 10 billion people in the whole world. And there is, or little did we anticipate, that 70% of this population in the whole world is actually living in urban areas. Okay, maybe little did we expect, because we know that maybe people in the rural areas maybe reproduce faster than people in the cities. We don't know actually, but there is a tendency that even if people in the rural areas reproduce faster, but these people will tend to gravitate into the urban areas. Why am I telling you that? Okay, why am I telling you that? Because this particular situation is what is going to complicate the socioeconomic condition in the urban areas. Hence, this particular paper or this particular model, the food supply distribution system, is basically inspired by the essentiality of meeting urban food needs, or MUFN, meeting urban food needs. There is a necessity, there is an urgent call to meet the food requirements of the urban areas, because that is where the 70% of the population even though how much effort devoted by uh, different government leaders to decongest the city and really make people live in the rural areas, somehow to decongest and spread the population, but still population growth tend to gravitate into the urban areas, probably because of high income opportunities. Maybe, probably because of, you know, there are a lot of opportunities in terms of really uh, being at the upfront or at the front of the development. We can see new technology there, and new fashion, new all sorts of new things are in the city, while we picture out the rural areas as backward in terms of technology and other things. But instead of really having our eyes appreciate towards the degree of appreciation, we realize at the end of the day that it's over burdening the food needs of the urban areas. And if we're not going to address that, there is going to be chaos, social unrest that will happen. So this food supply distribution system is actually, or basically, inspired by MUFN, or the the necessity of meeting urban food needs. Okay. Now, therefore, that is the focus. Why should it be oriented in that fashion? Because of the dire need, the necessity of really to create a more coordinated or effective and sustainable intervention of food production and also distribution in the urban areas. Okay, as FAO has really anticipated to us, now we really see that uh, doing this will also, there is a need really to uh, have an equitable distribution of food for the less uh, with those less income and those with high income, and of course the urgent requirement of the urban population of consuming the food that is fresh and safe. Okay, fresh and safe and directly produced right there at their backyard. So there's a need that distribution should be efficient in that sense. Okay, now for simplicity, FAO has divided FSDS, or Food Systems Distribution System, into two main subsystems. Okay, two main subsystems: food supply to cities and food distribution inside the city. Okay, food supply to the city, that means production, and food distribution inside the city. That is something like this. No, so you have here the first circle, which is food supply to cities. That is the production system. Okay, and there is also a need to make this functional, the food distribution inside the cities. Once it reaches the cities, how will it spread in terms of providing the food needs? What kind of market structure that should be there in order to enhance distribution of food? Okay, so these are the two, say for example, scenarios of the really dynamics that is going to happen for an effective FSDS, or food supply distribution system. By the way, uh, here in this particular no in this particular uh, say model or trend, FSDS will soon replace VCA, or value chain analysis, because this one, as we have already known, value chain analysis actually is effective for market-oriented, no, a market-oriented distribution system. But in the urban areas, there are people living there, burdening the food distribution of the urban areas with really less bankable, less bankable socioeconomic condition. So what will you do with them? Are you not going to feed them? We feed them in a way that really matches also the needs that they have, and of course without burdening the food supply in the city, because they will also compete with the demand for food in affluent areas inside the city. Okay, so that is, we need to really see the balance between the two. Okay, at least we will not be creating a so distressful condition among the poorest poor of people living inside the city. Okay, so uh, you have here the policy is to really meet the urban food needs in the city. Okay, now food supply distribution systems are complex combination of activities, functions, and relations. What are these complex activities? Production, handling, transport, and processes, packaging, wholesale, retail, etc. No? Enabling the cities to meet their food requirements. Distribution to affluent areas, distribution to less affluent areas, and so on and so forth. No? And the needs to for packaging and the quickness of the distribution, logistics, and such and so very complicated, say, system and concern also. That's why in this particular say model, there is a need to really what to really uh, have a very informed and a very vivid understanding of what's going to happen in the city, what's the dynamics inside the city in terms of food supply and in terms of food distribution. Okay, in terms of food distribution. Otherwise, if it's not equitably or if the distribution is really making others become more and more hungry and others are also becoming very, very well provided, it will create social unrest. Okay. Now, players need infrastructure also if we distribute food in the city. Okay. If we distribute food, we need infrastructure in terms of information, communication, and even technology, and also physical infrastructure. So this definition leads itself or lends itself to the systems concept. Okay, in other words, because of the complicacy, okay, because of the complicacy of the problem inside the city, in the production of food and in the distribution of food, we need to have, we need to backtrack a little and think about a possible, really perspective, a holistic perspective that lends itself from what we call as the systems concept of agribusiness. Okay, the systems concept. Now, FSDS must have an appropriate geographical limit also. If you look at the if you have a FSDS for a particular, say, city, okay, FSDS, food supply distribution system of a particular city or metropolis, you need to define your boundary also because the system has, if you want to analyze the whole area as one system, there are various subcomponents inside that system, and then we have to know what is our boundary. A systems design needs criteria to characterize what issues are directly relevant. That is how to define our boundary. Okay? For example, Metro Manila. Where is Metro Manila really ends in terms of food supply and distribution system? Is it does it end up to Calamba or Canlubang or where? Or in Bulacan or in Batangas? Where? Which part of we call the greater Metro Manila, where if we supply food, it will be circulated within the intricacies of its own distribution system. Baka mamaya pagpasok ng food supply in Metro Manila, it will go to Baguio. Baka mamaya pagpasok noon, it will go to Cebu. It happens. No? It happens. So even for example, just for example, just to tell you, a bell pepper produced in Ormo, which is actually intended for Cebu market. And you know what? One buyer, I mean, from what we know, one particular buyer buys us from Ormoc and brought to Cebu, and he brought that back to Ormoc to supply a particular, say, institutional buyer here in Ormoc. So it's really defeating the purpose. It's actually needed to supply the needs in Cebu, but it's going out of Cebu. So we need to define a clearer boundary so that the dynamics within the system are served. No? It should be within the intricacy. That's why we need to know and understand the complexity of the distribution system inside the city or inside the urban areas so that the food will really serve the food needs in the urban areas. So that means we need to understand market and non-market instrument in this case, which makes the whole thing complicated because we are going to create a systems modeling approach in FSDS analysis. No? Now, there are two various functions performed by FSDS. It can be grouped into two subsystems. If you do FSDS, you have to understand two important group of subsystem. One is food supply to cities, and the other one is food distribution or urban food distribution. Food supply and food distribution system. Okay? The food supply includes all activities that are required to produce food and bring it to the cities. Production, imports, as well as rural and peri-urban linkages, and so on. Now, in terms of, uh, uh, like, for example, uh, food produced in the cities, that actually includes food actually produced right there in the doorstep of the urban areas. Like for example, in Singapore, no? In Singapore, they produce vegetables in skyscraper buildings, even inside the building. They produce vegetable. Can you imagine by using the technology on aquaponics? Okay, they produce lettuce, they produce tomatoes in vertical, say, growing system. So tons of vegetables can be produced there. But our question here is: will it not also injure or hurt the distribution system of those food coming from the provinces and entering into the city? Will they are they not going to compete and head on, like for example competition, and down the line it will injure or hurt the industry in the rural areas? What do you think? The answer is no. It does not compete head on. Why? Because those produced in the urban areas by people in the, for example, skyscraper and also big buildings, these are serving a totally different markets, organically grown, fresh. They serve the needs of all those people who can afford at higher price, while those coming from provinces will serve the needs of people, those who are, for example, in the wet market or any other less affluent product format. Okay, so these are the things that we need to understand. If if in case this kind of system in Singapore is not existing in Manila or still emerging, that means to say it will be dominated by food distribution system coming from the province. So that is even more complicated in order to understand where the food is going to, uh, circulate within the city and circulate as fast as possible, as efficient as possible, and as effective as possible. No? The distribution has to be, because the needs in the urban area, especially if there is expanding population, there is a need that it should serve the customer while the food is fresh. Okay, you have to understand the retailing format there. You have to understand the various legislations and ordinances existing within the city. Even for example, color coding in Metro Manila. No, we have to understand that at this particular time of the day, huge trucks carrying huge vegetables or maybe truckloads of swine for butchering inside the city, they cannot pass through the certain area. They have to wait for for example, duration or period of the day. That's why these are the things that are included, so that in projecting for food supply to certain people, it will be smoother than expected. Okay? And much more, the disposal of waste must be understood also. No? So, food supply distribution system. First is production of food. Okay, food will have to be produced in areas presently under cultivation, of course. No, okay. If it is, and then in presently under cultivation, it should produce higher yields. From new lands and or imported also can also be produced. If it is not, if it's not uh, able, if they are not able to produce from existing lands or new lands to be opened, we need to consider importation. That's why when the supply of pork declined in Manila, all we need to do is to really import in order to dampen the inflationary effect. Okay, this requires increasing private investment for suitable land, safer waters and fertilizer and pesticides, and so on, and providing credits to producers. You might say that we have to use safe water for production. Okay? Safe water. What do you mean by safe water? Okay? Can we not use the water from Pasig River and spray that to our vegetables? Anyway, it will be biodegraded and then it will be absorbed and no more, no more what? No more contaminated water or polluted water. The water will just incorporate in the soil and will be absorbed and it will be almost like you cannot trace anymore the contaminated water. Is it uh, is it correct to reason out that way? The answer is wrong or no. The answer is no. Why? We have a first encounter. No? I have just learned this also that, di ba, in our garden, in our what fruit trees, in our particularly vegetables, no? And fruit trees also, no? In our even in our rice field, when we water our vegetable, we just get water from the canal and water our vegetables. And when we have this project together with Israeli technician or scientist, our attention were called. Our attention were called. Are you kidding? The Israeli uh, agronomist called. Are you kidding? You're watering the no. You're watering your vegetables or your plants using the water in the canal. You do not even know there are urines, there are whatever contamination, urine from animal manure or fecal manure from animals mixed there, and the water is so murky, and then you just water into your vegetables and tomatoes or even peppers. So wait, what's wrong with that? No, from now on we have to use underground water. Can you imagine underground water, potable water? You can drink the water the same as with humans. Only then we know that there are a lot of hygienic and microbiological considerations that we know. Know that we know. Why? Because if we water our plants with using any other water available in the surrounding areas, if we water from the canal or whatever, it will imbibe the very harmful bacteria into our plants, and it can even cause disease. And more so, it can even invite parasites to be alive in the soil that we are cultivating. So what happens? The Israeli technician said that is why you have a very poor and very low yield, very poor quality and very low yield of your vegetable because you are using the wrong water. And he said he was bragging also. Israel has no water. Israel has no water. Why? Because it is a desert land. But how come that we are importing? You importing. How come they are exporting rather? vegetables or agriculture produced to other countries. And there are only 3% of our farmers. And we have a very limited area. According to him, the secret is water. Now it's going to create competition between water for drinking and water for watering the plants. No? And true enough, to make a long story short, after our first harvest, bountiful harvest, we said second and third harvest, we subjected it to microbial, analysis. So those eaten fresh, we analyze. Those eaten processed, we analyze both. Very common between those unprocessed and processed vegetables. There is high percentage of Escherichia coli bacteria. Okay, so it's unsafe. It's unsafe. So how can you even think about water for people and water for, uh, like for example, the plants? How can you even think that way when the same thing, if you uh, use contaminated water, it will go back to the people eating contaminated food. And there's another burden to that. Another burden is that if you use the same type of water, except chlorinated water, if you use the same kind of water for people and for plants, there's going to be competition. And at the end of the day, you have to prioritize the people and the plants. But it is a very difficult competition because if you prioritize people, you will also, in effect, or and sooner or later, affect the population because of a declining supply for food, and not only food, quality food. So we're not talking yet about pesticides. That's why in the whole world, Israel has the best water management engineering practice, the best in the world. Nobody can compete that. Yan, gibinuangan pa mi. Ingon siya. You know what? Your people here are more industrious than or your farmer here are more industrious than our farmers in Israel. Why do you think? Alon, our agronomist. Because you will even be working when it is raining. You will even be working when it is so hot in the ano. That people are still working there, very industrious. But in terms of output, our farmers are more productive than your farmers. True enough, because we are using the wrong equipment. Sa ila, they can use the, like for example, uh, tractor. The tractor is air conditioned. Okay, if they spray, they will not go to the field. They just use the drone to spray their crops. It's unmanned sprayer. Spray the crops, finish for how many hectares in so short a time. So that's their system, and our system is really manual. So although we are industrious, but we are producing less in terms of production. So private investment has to go into that particular system because later on it's really going to complicate food production and distribution in the urban areas. If we are not going to take care of that, it will complicate also our distribution. Now, what about in peri-urban agriculture? Meaning to say those in the outskirts of the city. It should be produced in peri-urban areas, but not far enough that it's difficult to distribute. No? Because the farther the production areas from the city, the more or the higher would our concern on logistics become. Okay? So in terms of production, no, food production in urban and peri-urban areas has been receiving increasing attention because it can contribute to local supply of fresh. No? Kung kay production areas in the city and in neighboring areas of the city, you can be assured of local supply of fresh, nutritious, and uh, fresh vegetables or dairy products. It can also alleviate poverty because if the poor people in the city can be used to grow or can be employed to grow food, to grow vegetables, and so on. It's also cost effective because it can use organic waste for fertilizer. Okay, there are a lot of waste in the city. And if you decompose that properly, you can use that as fertilizer. Productive use of suitable and unused open spaces. There are open spaces that can be used in the city. Okay, so that is urban, or that is urban food distribution, food production. Now let's come to urban or peri-urban food distribution. There are two sides of the same system: production and distribution. There are a number of problems connected with urban and peri-urban food production, which stems from close proximity to densely populated areas. Okay, because if you uh, produce something, you also can distribute. Now, food production in the polluted environment may cause food contamination. Okay, if you put your production system very close to urban areas, it may cause food contamination because for example, the air, the water in the cities, or whatever source that we have, it's so contaminated. So it will also contaminate the food production. So distribution is another thing. Inadequate use of chemicals, solid and liquid waste in farming can contaminate food, soil, as well as water resource. Okay, the practice of livestock raising in and close to urban areas may generate health problems. That's true. The old imong ranso the animals. You're not only talking about tens or hundreds of animals. You're talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands of animals, and you are going to raise that up close to the city. No way. You will be an environmental problem by contributing to pollution and other problems in the city. Okay, so while many problems can be solved by, for example, by information and extension assistance, cities and local authorities, or CLAs, have responded by destroying food crops and evicting food producers and public lands under cultivation. This is to give way to various non-food urban development in the cities. Okay, naman yun na public lands in the cities, but it's people are occupying this. Ano po, ibutangan na po mga non-food establishments. Okay? Now, some various requirements of the cities are that directly indirectly relates to increasing food need required to meet the needs in the urban dwellers. There are other requirements in food needs in the urban areas for distribution. Now, what requirement is land use management to keep suitable suitable land in the urban areas for efficient and sustainable food production. Importante na. One is measures to protect human health and environment from contamination. And one very important thing, water supply, commensurate in quantity, or commensurate, not commensurate in quantity and quality for food production, processing, and drinking. Okay? You see, water that is commensurate in quantity and quality for production, for processing, and drinking. Siyempre, the water should be clean. Ngayon gamiton sa imong mga tanom. Okay? Now, how is that possible in areas close to the city? Sufficient supply of fuel wood. Baka mamaya, you have a production or processing system close to the city, but you will also deforest areas in the city. Additional wholesale markets for slaughterhouse, retail outlets, easily accessible. these are requirements, or these are requirements that will impact on food distribution in the urban areas. Okay, so requirements. Facilities for spontaneous market, quick distribution, private investment in food shops, market improvement, and transport. So these are very important. No? Coherent and well understood food production, processing, and marketing regulations. So from physical to to socioeconomic to political factors affecting urban food distribution and of course production. The expanding population in the urban areas also requires enhancing of food production both in terms of quality, freshness, and packaging diversity. There are requirements to this for because if you distribute, you have to think about packaging. Okay, if you distribute, you think about distance and utilization of space, measures to protect human health. Of course, you have to think about packaging, appropriate arrangement to use wastewater. Okay, if you put your, for example, huge bagsakan in the close to the city, you have to locate that in areas where it's not going to be polluting. Can you imagine? One vegetable trading center, for example, in Bayongbong, Nueva Vizcaya. In Bayongbong, Nueva Vizcaya, there is one uh, uh, vegetable trading center there that accumulates waste about 30 tons a day. Can you imagine? Mga peelings, all sorts of peelings and uh, plastic and also paper waste every day. No, because they leaves of dried leaves and rotten vegetables are piled there every day. 20 to 30 tons of waste every day. So what are you going to do with that? If there is no proper waste disposal and processing, you will find yourself rotting and smelling bad every day for the rest of the year. Very difficult. Simple and coherent, well understood food production regulation. Okay. If you distribute also food, you have to be prepared. You have to prepare a plan for importation in case there is going to be food shortage. Now you have to think about where to access, either in neighboring regions or in neighboring countries. There has got to be regulations that govern this. Okay, imports. Once once produced, food products need to be assembled, packaged, stored, processed, and transported various to various areas. Okay, no? So these are very important in food distribution. Now another that concerns imports, you need to also think about handling, packaging, storage, and transport facilities. And not only that, what are the appropriate legislation and regulatory guidelines? In one city, there are how many? There are. It's composed of various, uh, say for example, LGUs or, uh, well, yes, LGUs or city government. And each government is really almost like independent among the others. So they have a very different, what is uh, not allowed in one area may be allowed in another area. What is allowed in not allowed in other area may be also something like this. May be partially allowed in other areas. So these are conflicting sometimes legislation, and we have to consider this in for efficient distribution of food, and of course cutting down on prices of food for many people to afford the price in the market. Okay, not only that, what about post-harvest handling of food? Post-harvest losses can be as high as 35% in perishable food product. How can you avoid that? How can you even reduce that? No? How can you even reduce that? Because otherwise, if these losses will go on, it will only impact on the cost or the price of the commodity or the processed product, but it will also impact on the supply. No? And down the line, it will impact on affordability. Food assembly is very important. Preparation and food handling, no? Very important. And then you have also food packaging. Okay, how will you package the food? Because packaging first has a function. It's not only packaged for the sake of packaging, but it's packaged for the purpose of one, provides convenient way of handling or transporting the produce. It provides protection to the product, and packaging can be used to divide the produce into convenient units for retail and also for wholesale markets. Okay, so packaging is very important, no? And packaging also informs the public about traceability like that, no? And are you going to use, say, for example, plastic containers, or you're going to use cardboard boxes, whichever is more convenient or more acceptable in a particular location. Just like for us before, we were used to transporting vegetable, fresh vegetable, in in sacks. Can you imagine? Kanang sako sa feed in sacks, loaded with what piles of Chinese cabbage, etc., or cabbage itself in sacks loaded to the ships. But with upscale market that we are catering, no way, they don't allow that kind of packaging. So it took a while before the Farmer Association adjusted themselves to the use of plastic crates. Okay? Can you imagine plastic crates or boxes? For tomatoes, for example, we use boxes that is actually uh, boxes for transporting fruits, like for example, apples. Okay? Or if economies of scale permits, they will have their own boxes built or like manufactured, and it will be sold in bulk to them. But how many farmers can afford that? So we resort on using boxes, can uh, say, for example, use boxes of apples, oranges from other countries, where the tomatoes will be placed. Before, it was just a plain what? Say, for example, uh, plain wooden crates. And then not only boxes, but there is a measure. Sa unang manggod, sumpay-sumpay yun ang boxes. So, duha na ka boxes gisumpay, and then banga. No way. They have a prescribed level. It should not be Z-type at the on top, but it should be square. So that is a system. Plus, of course, the use of plastic crates imposed by the buyer. You know how much is one plastic crate? That's 450. Or if you can get a discounted one, maybe 380. One box. One box. How many boxes are you going to use? Boy, we are thinking about hundreds of them. Hundreds of them. So one delivery will be like 80 boxes. And then it will take around maybe 2 weeks before the boxes will return to the to the association. We will transport again. So if you have only a few boxes, plastic crates, very difficult for you to really transport. Plus, of course, the danger of missing crates. It can happen. So these are the things that you have to factor in to the marketing cost. So food packaging is very important. No? Only food packaging is storage. Okay, that's why ano, we cannot respond to huge demand for food. Okay, huge demand that for a particular product that should get to the shelves of the customers or the buyers in less than 2 hours. Example, as I have told you, spinach or water spinach, kangkong or alugbati. There is a huge demand for alugbati in Cebu, for example. One one particular buyer there would like to buy alugbati, 300 to 400 kilos of alugbati every other day. Can you imagine? Every other day, the 100 to 400 kilos can be produced by the entire barangay easily if you mobilize every household there to contribute at least 1 kilo every other day. The house rural women can do that. That's kind of maybe quick to think about. But in terms of distribution, how can it arrive Cebu market in less than 2 hours? Supercat will not allow us to put that in their ship. So no way, cancel. But the producer inside close to Cebu can do that. So they produce. But the thing is, storage. How can you store that? It will not also wilt. That's our storage concern, and not only processing concern. Because food that will get into the city has to be processed either as primary process or secondary processing. So these are concerns in food distribution, not only the actual practice themselves, but the people who will manage. Do we have the skills? Okay, in terms of doing this particular activity in the city. So it's getting more and more complicated as we see the details of the requirements for food distribution in the city. Okay? And we're not only talking about one buyer, we are talking about hundreds or even thousands of them inside the city for a very big city. There are those that operate only during the night. There are those that operate only during morning, and so on. Different landscape of dynamics. So food processing is really very important. Uh, there is a situation, for example, in market in India for meat and meat products that operate during nighttime, informal market. But the volume of trade, boy, is very big. 60 million or 200 million US dollars ang annual volume aning trade. So it cannot be ignored by food distribution system, the city, because people in these countries are used to street foods. Maybe 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, street food vendors actually are sprawling already in various uh, key locations in the city. Unlike in the Philippines, we are so, you know, uh, confined at home. We don't normally eat, seldom do we eat food outside of our home. If we eat, we go to a more cozy restaurant. But people in these countries, like in India and also Bangkok or in Thailand, they are used to eating food along the streets. That's why I have a friend who's driving a Toyota Hilux, but in the afternoon, the Toyota Hilux become a restaurant, ambulatory restaurant. Tuan ang mga food niya, open ang iyang stall, selling food, at the tables, ikargara dito sa iyang sakyanan, and then pag 4 o'clock, linya na siya dito. Nanay mga food, luto na. Dito ra sa iyang car, you cargo box sa iyang Hilux. Nagluto ng pagkaon, distribute na sa mga table. Because people we've been plucking from the office, they will always pass by a certain favorite place selling all kinds of street food, dinner, and when they get home, tapos nagkaon. Okay? That's their lifestyle. And this particular lifestyle is affording the city or the government a unignorable magnitude of revenue to the tune of 60 to 100 million US dollars every year. Can you imagine? Okay? Transport is also another concern in the city. And then also, when we say transport, there is also what we call as concern for uh, cost also. Now, urban distribution. We see production and we see urban distribution. We think about how the market works in the city, and also we think about how many players are in the markets, wholesale players, and also what are the formats in terms of retailing, where are they located, what is their system of distribution. Okay, so different, like for example, countries have different formats. Okay? In Cebu, for example, there are maybe close to 100 wholesalers. operating. But you think you compare that with buy-buy. You know how many wholesalers operating in buy-buy? It depends. In most cases, there's only one. We call that Alpor. No? Now, if you're a trader or a farmer selling certain volumes of vegetable, you just sell that to the Alpor, and the Alpor will distribute because the Alpor has the money, can always pay cash on delivery, something like that. Okay, so that's a different format. But in cities, it's different. In Cebu, you have so many of them. No? So not only wholesalers, but there are also the format of their retailers. In other countries, they have also several retailers, like for example in Vietnam. No? Now, if these wholesalers also has storage facilities, inadequately handling this will also result in high food damage. Consequently, if food damage is high, consumer prices will also be very high. No? So there is also what you call as intra-urban transport, meaning to say transport within the city. Okay, intra-urban transport. Okay, that will also, like for example, complicate if not facilitate the distribution. Thinking about the wholesaler, we think about the retail outlets. Okay, how many retailers? What are their formats? What are their frequency of operation? In Cebu, for example, there are groups of retailers that only operates from 12 o'clock in the 12 o'clock midnight up to 4 o'clock. So if you want to interview them, you have to be there in the wee hours of the evening. 12 o'clock, na, parking na sila. And then by 4 o'clock, close, wala na sila. Ato kag alas 6, wala na. Mao na ang uban, mangupra, they will do their marketing very early in the morning because it's very cheap. But the moment you go there, you go to that market. I'm talking about carbon market in Pasil. You go there, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, no more. The vegetables that they are selling in the during the graveyard, the time of the night, is already being handed down to another player, and it's already becoming more and more expensive. Okay, these are ambulatory retailers. Okay, there are, so in other words, we need to understand the dynamics of retailing in the city, and because we cannot avoid that there are retailers with different mode and timing of selling, because as this gets numerous, parking would be difficult. So that's why they can only park during the night. That's why they will also be there in the market during the night. It's also very practical and very common in Vietnam, and even in Manila, and even in Cebu. No, they will be bringing their uh, maybe mini truck only in the night where they can park. Because if they go there in the daytime, they cannot park, they cannot sell. That's why they are present only in the nighttime. And then uh, they cannot also sell this kind of vegetable if the the stalls inside the public market are so packed with people. So retailing is really something that we need to take into consideration. In Lima, Peru, and also in Senegal, for example, in Africa, things of this format is very evident. Now, food shops also is one. How many food shops are operating in the because these food shops influence the way market also is going to be textured or formatted. Because, for example, in Tacloban, with the proliferation of meat shops in the city, meat shops in Tacloban, you are talking something like maybe 40 to 60 licensed food shop in Tacloban. And when you know what's the effect? The effect there is the wet market is getting very, very compressed. Or in other words, the transaction activity of the wet market selling meat is so limited, also has become limited. So I said, if you go to the wet market, maybe 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, there's nobody selling meat there because all transactions at the meat market has to be done 4 up to 6 o'clock in the morning. Because after that time, all meat are already absorbed by either restaurant or meat shops. So empty stalls in the wet market at like 8 or 9 or 10 in the morning, wala na. It's all gone, sold to restaurants and meat shops. That's why it has changed the format. Niadto, any time of the day, maadto ka sa wet market, you can buy all sorts of, meat there until 4 o'clock. But this time, no way. 7 o'clock, pinaka-late. After that, wala na karne sa merkado. So it affects the formatting. Food shops, modern retailing like meat shop, no? Or maybe kanina ay mga convenience store or supermarkets. There are modern retailing. All of them will really go to the supermarket because the supermarket has a good format and also retailing system. Now, modern retailing covering 800 kilometers between a particular region is very troublesome because if the farther you are from the urban areas, the more costly your transport cost becomes. So we need to understand how modern retailing is really influencing the food distribution in the city. There is also what we call as informal sector retailing. So retailers are very dynamic. They usually come and go, no? Like ambulatory retailers, as I said, appear lang ng gabi, wala na pagbuntag, no? Or there are also ambulatory, like very small quantity sold in just the dyan lang sa talipapa or tabi-tabi. No? Informal activities of retailing. They will be moving around, carrying their small basket and selling this vegetable. They are very part and parcel of the retailing business in the city. No? You can see them in Bye-Bye, Calamansi, in small basin. They will move around and selling this to the people. You might say very small quantity or the volume may be small. You think about only one, but there are hundreds of them. What can you think? What can you say? What can you say? No? It will impact on the food distribution. We have to know the dynamics and the impact of these various we call informal sector retailing. No? Street food restaurant, as I have said that a while ago, it can impact on food distribution. So that's the effect of two subsystems that is going to impact on the distribution of food and production of food for urban areas. No? Now let's come to the designing and implementing an FSDS or food system distribution system. There are steps that should be observed, no? In designing and implementing an FSDS. But first, we need to understand the three macro issues in food systems. One is quality and quantity of food of supply, accessibility and low prices, and anticipation and prevention of disruptions in supply. No? Quality and quantity. First, access, okay, of the product to low prices and preventing disruptions. In other words, regularity of supply. So once you are like deciding to make an FSDS, we need to consider the macro and the micro, look at the whole system. So we need to understand the relationship between various components of the food supply distribution system. Because these various components will actually define the distribution and the production of food for the needs of the urban areas. So systems modeling ang importante ani. So there is what you call as FSDS model, and to some extent define the system if systems is self-regulated by the market and by economic assumptions. Okay? Now, remember, the system can be affected by various factors: political factors, market, environmental factors, and few others. No? So that designing and implementing an effective FSDS involves the following six key steps. Step one is you have to have food supply and distribution system as a complex system. Really look at the network, no? In food supply and distribution, understand the network of the food production and distribution in that particular location that you are analyzing. Okay, it's a systems look. What are the what are the relationships between components? No? First step of our study aims to demonstrate the extent of FSDS can be treated as a complex system, presenting the characteristics, the entirety, and the feedback, linearity, time perspective, and so on of the various, shall we say, production and distribution. Just like, for example, the value chain and even supply chain perspective can help us. For example, when example lang, in the auction market of rice or maybe flowers in Kunming, China, the auction market of flowers in Kunming, China is done, for example, at maybe uh, 4 o'clock or even 2 o'clock in the morning in Kunming, China auction. Why is it done at that time? Because the flowers should be in Singapore or in Hong Kong market before 9 o'clock. It should arrive there before 9 o'clock so that it is time bounded. And you have to understand how is it possible to do that. If you do not have a systems perspective, you will end up losing in the process. Mango in what? In Davao Oriental, harvested today, it should reach Hong Kong in less than a week. So there is really an intricate distribution system. So that is very important, understanding the dynamics of the entire system. Okay, in the distribution, it's a supply distribution. So uh, the concept of systems dynamic analysis or systems dynamic models is an appropriate, say, tool for this one. Systems dynamic. How the systems operate. No? Systems dynamic. So that is first step. The second step is comparative assessment of the complexity of the system. This aims to operate a comparative analysis of different approaches useful in understanding the complex. No? So that means to say our knowledge in modeling, we know already how the system works, what kind of computerized or systems-based modeling that would be applicable to this. No? I give you a certain uh, say scenario to this. Now, in in Bandung, Indonesia, the demand for what? The demand for like exotic meat for exotic meat for wildlife in that market is surprisingly affected by the dynamics of tribal relations in the forest. Surprisingly affected, no? You cannot just go there because it's affected by the tribal relationship. If they have war, and what is the possibility that we are not going if they are not going to engage in war? It's a very fragile tribal relationship, and that affects distribution of this exotic uh, meat into the market because of their dynamic socioeconomic and customary dynamics of people living in the forest. If you do not understand the that dynamics, you won't be able to predict when are we going to have this kind of meat in the market? When are we not going to have this? And how can we prevent the, the availability or the shortage of this particular meat in the market? We have to understand the dynamics up there. And you know what? Unsa ra ilang awayan? Forest tea. Kanang kahoy nga himuong tsa. Ora na ilang awayan dito. So, mag-away na sila, awa na, maapektuhan na tong urban areas. So, in other words, there is a need to sustain and sustain the agriculture and availability of this forestry ecosystem in the forest there so that the supply of meat down there in the city, this particular type of meat, because naman sa niche market, the supply will not be affected. And if forestry is well bloomed, okay ka ng supply dito. Mag-away din sila na. Ilog man. So, you see, the connection, urban market, and the dynamics of the traditional or customary relationship in the upland areas. That is just one example. Now, what about no? What about the other relationships to understand? It's really, we really have to not only that, di lang ang ilang gira, we have to understand the birth rate and the death rate, the balance of population. Siyempre, o naiuban nga, nangamatay di, why gira? So, birth rate and death rate. You have to model para makibaw ka how much quantity available of that kind of meat in the niche market down there in Bandung, Indonesia, the city of Bandung. Grabe ka complex. And this also is actually happening in a different format in food distribution systems in the city. That's the second step. Identifying the complexity and the dynamics, and of course, the appropriate analytical model to use. Okay. Now, in the second step, we need to have a systems dynamic thinking already. Systems dynamic. What are the factors affecting this distribution and production of this food? And then addressing emergent behavior. It involves market, non-market, and even social and tribal. Now, it also affects the rainfall pattern. That's why spatial geographic assessment is very important. Okay? So, the third step is first, second, third. The third step is systems archetype analysis of FSDS dynamics. What is this archetype? Okay? In other words, we know already, first is we understand the system, and then we tend to really mentally map out the system. Then the third step is we kind of implement that. We need to understand. The first step is understanding that it is a complex system. The second step is really identifying the boundaries and key players within the system. And the third step is making a CLD or causal loop diagram. CLD or causal loop diagram. What is that? Understanding the relationships between players, between subsystems that are existing in that particular location. So, what particular is it sustainable? Is it exploding? Is it converging or something like that? Understanding the causal loop diagram. So we need to understand. I will give you an example of a causal loop diagram later on, and then you have to by looking at that particular diagram, you tend to understand. Okay, you tend to understand how are they related. For example, this one. Systems archetype applied to food supply distribution system in a particular location as presented by Armendaris et al. Okay? This one is, you have, what are the components? Urban population, you have urban demand. The urban population affect the urban demand. So there is, in other words, positive effect. Sorry, positive effect. And then, other than food, ang urban population po, kinanglan po na, no? Dagdag ganiya. And then the urban food demand will affect the urban food volume. Okay? Urban food volume in a negative way. And then you have the urban food volume, urban food will also impact on ano, uh, urban population and urban space. If you mag-increase ka og urban food, mo increase imong what? Urban space demand. In other words, ang iyang direction ani paana, no? In other words, from this one to here. And there is also another situation. Urban, and this, for example, these are relationship. Urban population and urban space will impact on road. Obviously, magdaghan mo og kuan, guot mo sa kalsada, no? And then here we have urban food availability will decrease urban food policy and urban and rural level. Okay? Urban food demand, ang rural food maapektuhan na. Siyempre, mahugot pa na dito, makulang na po ng rural food needs. And then, ang rural food needs will actually impact in a positive way, okay, sa crop and livestock. And crop and livestock will also impact on a positive way sa organization of food supply distribution. Okay? Magkadaghan ang livestock o crops, magkadaghan po ang concern for urban food distribution. Very macro relationship. How each different components impact each other. No? Now, more if there is if roads are already congested, it will increase congestion, and congestion will decrease. Okay? Congestion will decrease. Organization of food will negatively affect ba? Organization. How can you even make distribution more efficient kung congested na? So these are subjected to various relationship. So kanang positive or negative, these are very important directions in terms of how each one affects the other. Now, here you have in that particular model, now archetype analysis to FSDS are functioning of FSDS are embedded in the urban dynamics. Population growth, systems to be integrated. These are the various considerations in the urban food dynamics. Okay. You have the fourth step, okay, na kay causal loop diagram. The fourth step, elaboration of the causal loop diagram. Imo nang taga-agbuhay itong imong causal loop diagram based on the conventions of FAO. Naman na sila, imo nang, in other words, tagaan imong buhay from skeleton, tagaan imo na flesh and blood imong model para ma-input mo na ito sa computer. Okay? Computer. And then, you have, at this step, classification of variables in terms of whether it is a stat or flows or endogenous or exogenous variable has to be done. No? Specified na. Rate ba na or level ba na? No? So you have to put life into that causal loop diagram. And what are the policy variables involved? No? Okay. The FSDS causal loop diagram in figure 61 shows complete image of the work done. Okay. Conceptualize the FSDS and finally characterize and analyze their dynamics. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you an illustration in just a short while, and then you have to see that, to remember that in the causal loop diagram, the fourth step is really to make it more to follow the conventions of FAO para magkabuhay utangan mong different variables para mo dagan dito sa computer. Okay, the FAO guide, which is the fifth step. Okay, you have that fifth step after providing the conceptualization description. We need to put, you know, variables or values into your model. No, starting from the uh, CLD elicited in Figure 60, and then you have to conceptualize simply the environmental complexity, and we frame them into the bubble diagram. Now, what is a bubble diagram? No, now you have here. I will go very fast here. This is a bubble diagram. Okay, so kanina we only model this part of the system. Okay, this part of the system here, urban processing. But this one, it's already an expanded version with values already with mga rectangles. That means these rectangles are levels or quantity that is really going to be estimated. These rectangles, and this, for example, uh, these arrows here are actually the direction of the effect. No? So that this will not only involve market, but this will also involve policy variable, even quality variable, and even mga engineering variables. You see here, there are requirements for HACCP requirements, there are requirements for commercial farms, there are policy affecting natural resource, etc. All the different variables, and also, say for example, variables and certain, say for example, what certain dynamics. No, so you should be guided for example, say the variables assigned in terms of R1, R2, R1, and so on, all the R's, all the B's, and all the other description, because the usually the uh, the the B's are the critical, uh, for example, uh, base value to observe. No, okay, base value, and the R are actually providing us the rate. Now the rectangle are actually levels, no, that we are going to estimate. For example, land use for new infrastructure. So doon na ba? We want to see if there are available land used for regular infrastructure. And then you have land demand for production. Level also, that is quantity. And then you have available land from outside. So napaka available land. Okay? An existing commercial farm, it's a level actually. Urban population, it's a level that you need to monitor. So these rectangles are actually very important to monitor, because these are the key indicators whether our system is giving us accurate projection, or teaching us that the system is sustainable or what or not. No? So this is a framework of the system. The urban space, you have here production and distribution, and you have what policy variables are needed. Okay, what policy variables? Food demand at market level, that will impact on policy, so that the policy now will be guided in terms of answering also urban space and infrastructure requirement. Okay, so these are interactions of factors responsible in the production and distribution of food in the city. Production and distribution, urban population, economy in the city, and then technology also available resources, and urban space and infrastructure needs. Now, the ultimate goal is to design a policy that will address this and also make the other factors more sustainable. Okay? So that's the framework. The objective there is more logistically efficient and effective distribution of food. Why? Because if you are not going to attend to this, it will create social unrest in the city. And down the line, it will redound to unstable market and unstable economy. Okay. So the sixth step is actually modeling conceptualization of the causal loop diagram. In other words, having created a computer program for this, we need to simulate, simulate if in fact it will give us the correct projection. First step, the first step up to this stage of the model has now a clear, more apparent result of the food distribution. Supply food distribution is a system dynamics model, or yeah, system dynamic model. The sixth step is critical, initializing the construction and subjecting that for computer modeling. Okay, and then use a programming code. They call it power sim, or other one, agent-based modeling. And then also we can use dynamic model software, or Dynamo, to really simulate the system's dynamics existing. Okay, down the line it can give us a projection. What will happen to our model in the food distribution? In other words, the what once you have the system modeled in the computer, you are now going to simulate, so that after simulating, you need to tighten the assumptions if it cannot predict a what we call as the base case scenario. Okay, base case scenario, that means to say it can accurately simulate the situation without base case scenario, but that means to say no change in policy. The current scenario, if it can predict the current scenario in the model, then that's the starting point. Before we uh, say, for example, test that for like what will happen in 30 years, what will happen in 1 year. In other words, test the model at year zero if it can accurately predict the situation, and then run it for like 30 years, 20 years, 15 years, so that we would be able to determine and anticipate what's going to happen. The purpose of this particular, for example, model is to really help the decision maker. Okay. Originally, the BAU, or business as usual scenario, mao na iyang i-predict yun before synthesizing the model. No? Now, consequently to this result, BAU simulation will be a stepping stone in sensitizing the model. You change one policy, what will happen to the land area? You change a certain policy, health protocol, what will happen to the supply? Something like that. No? Especially this time, dunay pandemic, we need to include that in one of the variables in the system's dynamic modeling. The first scenario include application of rural context. The second involve the citizens' policies. Ano mo ni mo kanang bang test ang like for example sensitivity sa model, no? Once it predicts with accuracy on these three different scenarios, what are these three different scenarios? You have rural context or policies, and then citizens context, and the third is you have policies, of course, on investment or economic policies. Imo lang i-tanaw kung consistent ba siya. Once it predicts accuracy, then it is ready for testing to see the effect of various policies that can be done in the future. Okay, so this is how the model used. But very importantly, this particular model, FSDS, has a one very important requirement. I'm just giving you this one as just an overview of what is going to happen in the future. First, we need to have a systems dynamic orientation. Systems dynamic orientation is not linear thinking. Parang kani ana ra gyud, linear ra gyud, kundi it's dynamic. There are other factors involved. So we need to have a systems perspective. in really understanding the relationship of various players within the food system. Another thing, this particular model needs to have excellent like understanding and in immersion in how we understand and really identify the players and the boundaries. And most importantly, this particular model needs to have a like for example a uh, a enough skill and grasp of the computer application or computer model. I was telling you about PowerSim, Dynamo, Stella model. These are process-based modeling. These are not the same as your multiple regression, linear regression. No, it's different. It is a computer-based modeling and skill to write the program for this one. That means to say, from relationship, you make it's almost like this involves computer programming. But if we are familiar with the software, we would be able to predict or maybe write the relationship and be able to understand better what is FSDS. The complexity, because for example, value chain is just a linear analysis, but FSDS is more than that. However, we can use our knowledge in value chain analysis because value chain analysis it's all about market lang, how you meet the requirements of the market. But in FSDS, not only the market, but available resources, available land area, impact on other areas also, something like this, a complex system. It's a systems perspective. And, and having this particular knowledge, it becomes more sustainable in the future. And environmentally, like uh, providing protection. So there is more advanced knowledge requirement for the agribusiness development in the fourth industrial revolution. If we are only good at using the computer, we need to level up to understand how this computer communicates with people, something like that. That's the fourth industrial revolution. It's all about connectivity. That's FSDS. So we have discussed in this module two global trends and models for affecting industry, supply chain clustering, and FSDS. Just to give you a shadow of what is yet to come. As population and business becomes complicated, now the convention that we are using today will no longer be applicable in the future. It needs a far more sophisticated knowledge of really an understanding of the system. With that, I leave you this particular lecture. So, the module exam, as I have said, will be given next week. Okay? Will be given next week. Then, after the module exam, that is Saturday. After the module exam, I will also uh, uh, like continue with the report, and then the report will become our last exam. But I'm not going to give you exam, but the credit of your report, your rating of your report, written and also the presentation becomes your rating for the last exam that we will have. So, ayuhan ang inyong report. No? Thank you and God bless.